So, we are in a moment of distress. And I'm not actually talking about the Lions, although that is distressing. The last 3 weeks have seen events unfold in our national life that are, to use a word that is increasingly tired out, unprecedented. But not only unprecedented, but alarming. I think many of us have been on heightened senses of alert for the last 20 or so days, as each day brings a new unfolding of things that we could not have imagined even 6 months ago. I want to be clear that this actually has very little to do with politics. We open our service every week saying that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, and I'll simply add, or how or whether you voted, you're welcome here. And we mean that. But I think it is important that we be explicit that the fact that we say that at the beginning of every one of our services means that we as a congregation, as a spiritual community, as a community of faith, are committed to, among other things, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are committed to welcoming absolutely everyone, not because it's the right thing to do, but because it is actually good. We are actually better when there is a diversity of people among us. And love of neighbor, which is the core grounding principle of our faith, instructs us to seek that everyone has equitable outcomes and flourishes. And that every space, particularly this space, is one in which everyone feels and actually is fully included. So, the recent onslaught against all of that means that if you are committed to that sort of project of eliminating DEI from society, you are welcome here, but you might find it a little uncomfortable. Because while trans people are being made scapegoats in our society at large, they are very welcome here. While immigrants are being scapegoated and removed from our midst, while our neighbors are being deported and caused to live in fear for their place in our society, we here say that they are very welcome here, and that this sanctuary is a safe space for them. I know that I speak for St. John's, which from its inception has had a long history of being a place of welcome and hospitality. And so those of us who call St. John's home and are committed to that sort of project have been grieved and distressed in the last 3 weeks. And not simply by some abstraction out there, not simply because we're scrolling through our news feeds and seeing things, it's because the people in our lives that we know personally, that we work among, are being impacted. Because we have followed the call of Jesus to draw near to those whom society regards as being on the margins, as being less valuable. And so we are in proximity to the people who are being affected, and we feel it keenly. And all of that has had me in, oftentimes the last 3 weeks, some pretty dark headspaces. And I would imagine that many of you have been there as well. And this isn't exactly helped by popular culture. Someone pointed this out recently on a podcast that I was listening to, that to the extent that TV shows or books or things that have been in the popular culture conversation over the last several years, couple of decades, have looked at the future, it is almost always a dystopian view of the future, whether we're talking about The Walking Dead or The Last of Us or The Handmaid's Tale. We look at the future in our imagination and have trouble seeing anything other than doom on the horizon. And never mind fiction, our everyday lives seem to be informing us that that is indeed the direction we are headed. We are worried about the climate and the ecological surroundings that we inhabit, and we are right to be concerned. There is another pandemic on the horizon, it would seem. To say nothing of the erosion of democratic norms and societies, not just here but around the world, as far-right factions seem to be taking hold. But I said at the beginning of the service, we come here to be reminded and encouraged of better things. We come here because we have this urge, as I reminded our children, to hope, to imagine something better. I saw this quote over the last couple of weeks, and it's been sitting with me. To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. I said to our kids that we use the term hope oftentimes as kind of like this very uncertain word. I hope that things turn out. And if that's our conception of hope, then it is hard to have much hope right now. The movements seem to be against the vision that we have for the good, the beautiful, and the true. To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. In each of the passages that we read today, Simon and Isaiah find themselves in moments of despair, moments of uncertainty, moments where they too looked at the future and had an element of doom. Isaiah's is a large-scale national sort of despair. Righteous King Uzziah that had led reforms was dead. And anytime there's a new king coming to the throne, you don't know what you can expect with confidence. Peter, living as a fisherman, day to day, depending on a catch of fish, has worked all night and caught nothing. His partners and his family's immediate survival for the next 24 hours is in doubt. A short-term moment of despair and distress. And in each of these moments of despair and distress, the divine shows up. And I think this is often what we imagine hope to be. I hope God shows up and fixes it. I can't see a way forward, and so I hope, against hope, that God will show up and fix it. And so there is a divine encounter. Isaiah sees a vision of the Lord on the divine throne, a vision of majesty and glory. Peter is visited by Jesus with this provision of a miraculous catch of fish, so great that it actually threatens their livelihood by breaking the equipment they depend on for the next day. The blessings of God are sometimes a little inconvenient. What strikes me about each of these encounters is that when presented with the divine, when Isaiah is presented with this vision of the divine that suggests that despite the death of the righteous king, God is still on the throne. And in spite of Peter being met in his moment of absolute lack with radical abundance, their response is one of hopelessness and despair. I don't know if you noticed that, but both of them respond with this note of dismay. Isaiah sees the power and the majesty and the goodness of God enthroned, stable and secure and sure, and says, "Woe is me." Woe is not a word, it's a noise. It's the sound you make when there's no word to say for how desperate you feel. Peter says to Jesus, "Get away from me. I'm sinful." Isaiah says, "I am undone, I am lost because I am a person of unclean lips and I dwell among a people of unclean lips." Isaiah's moment speaks the loudest to me as far as being an analogy for our moment. There are a lot of lips flapping, producing unclean speech. And I cannot say that I am often above it. But there is this cry of hopelessness and despair. And I think there's something deeply ingrained in us as human beings that fuels much of religion that informs why Isaiah and Simon respond this way. It is this sense that the problem is something core to who we are. That our sense is that to the extent we cannot look at the future with hope, it is because of us, because there is something so deeply broken in us that it cannot be resolved by anything other than direct divine intervention. And so when presented with the divine, there is this sense of despair. I am worthless. My children were very young when I became a pastor full-time, and they picked up on this. We were at a Sunday night prayer meeting, and we had kind of an open sharing time, much as we do here on Sunday mornings. And Joey, who was maybe 4 at the time, came up to the microphone. And it's one of these moments where, as a parent especially, but especially as a pastor parent, wearing those two hats simultaneously, the 4-year-old takes the microphone and you just hope. You just hope that does not go badly. He took the microphone and said, well, what's your prayer request, or what is it? And he just said, well, sometimes I'm naughty. 4 years old, and already a deeply ingrained sense that there was something deeply and morally flawed at the core of his being. That's tragic, because that is not the message that we are presented with. But if I'm honest, and as a reminder, I only get up here and talk to myself and welcome all of you to listen in, but I do hope that it's helpful for my friends. As I evaluate my interactions with the divine, I'm struck by how oftentimes when I bring myself before God consciously, the first thing that arises in my mind are the words, I'm sorry. I have this deeply ingrained sense, and I would imagine many of us do as well, that there's something that I need to be sorry for in relation to God on a permanent, regular basis. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. It speaks to our sense that we cannot do anything to get ourselves out of the fixes that we find ourselves in, out of our moments of distress. And so I'm struck by the fact that these characters encounter the divine and this powerful and positive vision of God's power and goodness, and they're immediately struck by hopelessness and despair again. But then I'm struck by the response of the divine. The divine does not say to them, yeah, you really are messed up, and we're going to have to put you in extensive therapy and get you all sorted out, and maybe someday, I hope, you'll be able to be of some use. The immediate response in each case is not to indulge their self-pity, not to endorse their judgmental self-assessment, but rather to summon them, to send them, to commission them, to say, follow me. I have something for you to do. It's to reject the statement altogether. This business with the fiery coal doesn't solve Isaiah's sense of moral failure. Just made his lips burn. To me, it's like, why is that there? It's a bizarre sort of thing. Let me burn your lips, and now I want you to do something. God looks at these two and says, no, that's not the picture. Get up. We have work to do. My kids this week were saying to me that they wanted me to bring something back that had been an element of my preaching, which is that every sermon has to land with a now what? And I used to use that phrase. In other words, we share these visions, these stories of Scripture, and we need to do something with them. So here is the now what. As I've been thinking about these stories and thinking about our moment and thinking about my own mental space this last few weeks, I've been reminded of Paul's words that now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. And I have been thinking a lot about hope in particular, but faith is of a piece. So faith, hope, and love, this trio of virtues. Faith looks back and believes that God has done what God has said has been done. Hope looks ahead and waits. Hope looks ahead to what God has promised and waits for it. Those two taken together without love is a recipe for something that I know I have been guilty of and that I know has been ingrained in many of our traditions, which is that the posture of faith is simply to sit back and be passive. And I've seen some of this in recent conversations. And the thing about that is that in order to adopt that posture, in order to say, I'm not going to be troubled by anything. I believe that God has done what God has done, and I believe that God will do what God has promised. And I can just sit comfortably and wait. To adopt that posture means to deny what is real for all of us, which is a profound grief at the things that we have lost, the things that we have been in distress over. I think it does something that Calvin once rebuked me for when he was 2 or 3 and I had called him to account for something that he had done. And as I was relating what he had done wrong, he said, "Dad, you are telling the truth wrong." It's a very clever way of telling your father that he's lying to you. You're telling the truth wrong. And I think sometimes we tell the truth wrong about God. We say things like, God is in control, therefore I don't have to worry. We say things like, everything happens for a reason. We imagine that obedience is simply doing what God says without questioning and just trusting that everything will work out. We imagine that prayer is this process of saying, here's what I want, God, but I'll go with whatever you want in the end. Not your will, but mine is how we usually couch that. And so as I've been thinking about faith and hope, I've realized that those are impoverished views of God and not true to our experience as humans of grief and loss that is very real. And we can't just wish it away by saying, well, God's got this. God's on the throne. That's okay. And that's why I've titled the sermon that hope is a dangerous thing. That phrase comes from a film, and I'm not sure why I've been thinking about Germany in the 1930s for the last several weeks. It's a mystery to me, but it has been on my mind. And there was a movie that came out on Netflix a couple of years ago, Munich, The Road to War, and the line is taken from that movie. The movie centers on the historical actions of a British and German members of the Ambassador Corps around the Munich conference in 1938, where Neville Chamberlain famously announced peace for our time that lasted all of 11 and a half months before the outbreak of World War II. And they are actively trying to forestall what they see as a catastrophe. Both of them. They understand that this war would be catastrophic for both of their countries. And at one point they're having this intense conversation, and one of them says to the other, we have to maintain hope. And the other says hope is the most dangerous thing because it instructs us not to act. It instructs us to imagine that things will work out without our energy. And at the end of the movie, the British character has come back from the conference and says to his wife, I'm going to join the RAF. The war is coming. Chamberlain has simply bought us a year to get ready for it. And she says to him, but there's always hope. And he says, he repeats what his colleague had told him, hope is a dangerous thing and we would be better off without it. When I saw the movie for the first time, that line just would not go away because as a person of faith, I would think, no, we must always maintain hope. And so I say to us that hope is a dangerous thing if left to itself. These three remain, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. Faith looks back and believes. Hope looks forward and waits, but love looks around and acts. Love encounters the divine, and the divine says, now get up and do something. Love says, here I am, send me. Love believes what the divine sees in us, that we are not a people of unclean lips, dwelling among a people of unclean lips, that we have a commission. We are being sent into the world. And so hope acts. Love acts. That is what we are called to do. We are not called to sit passively back and wait with optimism. Neither are we to become overwhelmed by despair. To be radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. We have work to do. And that work will require courage. I mentioned that for many of us, the effects of what is going on are affecting people we know, and not so much us directly. Some of us are going to have to be courageous to show love for those we know who are being impacted. But even in that, it's easy to approach that with this sort of grim, we have work to do. Mount the resistance. We ride at dawn. I found it important, especially over the last week, to remember that love also finds reasons for gratitude. Love is not fueled by obligation. It's not we have to be about the business of love because God said so, but because it is truly good. And so love sees the gratitude of what God is like and responds accordingly, and therefore is also prone to seeing joy and beauty even in the midst of despair. That is one of the features of love. Part of our work is to insist that there is still joy and beauty and goodness and truth in the world. That the picture is not as grim as our newsfeed might tell us. I think this also means that we have to laugh. We have to be a people of good humor. Mel Brooks, whose movies and comedy I deeply appreciate, when he was asked about the movie The Producers, said the best way to defang a fascist is to make fun of them. To laugh. Because it's so absurd. It's such an absurd view of the world to engage in a fascist project. It's just silly. It's tragic, don't get me wrong. But we need to laugh. We need to help each other laugh. And because love is not fueled first and foremost by obligation, by a have to, that is the root of it being able to be unanxious. I think we can get really worked up and overwrought about the things that we see around us. Not being anxious doesn't mean being passive, but it means we keep our focus on doing the next right thing, on what's in front of us, on the things we've been sent to do, as we catch people out of the distress that we see around us. Amen? Amen.